Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the US dollar, the world's financial heartbeat, has collapsed overnight. Stock markets crash, oil prices skyrocket, nations scramble to save their economies. The global system that once seemed unshakable begins to crack before our eyes. For nearly 8 decades, the dollar has been more than just paper and ink. It's been the symbol of power, stability, and trust. But what if that trust vanished? What if the dollar, the currency that holds the world together, finally fell? This isn't just an American story, it's a global one. Because if the dollar collapses, no nation will remain untouched. Today, we'll explore what would really happen if the US dollar fell, and whether our world could survive the storm that follows. The rise of the almighty dollar. To understand what happens if the dollar falls, we must first understand how it rose to absolute dominance. After the devastation of World War II,
For ultimately it was a series of events that conspired together to eventually light the flame of war.
The world's most hated treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, thus starting World War II in 1939.
the world needed stability, a new financial anchor. In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, leaders from 44 nations agreed the US dollar would become that anchor, backed by gold and supported by the world's most powerful economy. America's massive gold reserves, unmatched industrial strength, and political influence made the dollar the ultimate symbol of security. For decades, every major currency was tied to it, and the dollar itself was tied to gold. Then in 1971, President Richard Nixon cut that link, ending the gold standard. But instead of collapsing, the dollar grew stronger. How? Because of oil. The U.S. made an agreement with Saudi Arabia. Oil would be sold exclusively in U.S. dollars. This petrodollar system forced every nation that needed energy, from Europe to Asia, to keep reserves in dollars. Today, over 58% of all global reserves are held in U.S. dollars. Around 90% of international transactions involve it. Whether it's gold in Dubai, coffee in Brazil, or microchips in Taiwan, the dollar stands in the middle of nearly every deal. It's not just currency, it's the bloodstream of global trade. And if that bloodstream stopped flowing, the entire system could go into cardiac arrest. Cracks in the foundation. But no empire lasts forever, and no currency is immune to time. Today, the U.S. faces mounting pressures that could one day weaken or even topple the dollar's dominance. The first threat is debt. America's national debt has surpassed $35 trillion, and it's still climbing. If investors ever lose faith in Washington's ability to manage that debt, they could start dumping U.S. bonds and dollars alike. The second is inflation. During crises like the pandemic, trillions of dollars were printed to stimulate the economy. But when too much money chases too few goods, value erodes. Over time, this erodes global confidence. The third threat lies in geopolitics. The world is shifting. Nations like China, Russia, and members of BRICS are openly challenging U.S. dominance. They're creating trade systems that bypass the dollar entirely, using local currencies, gold, or even digital money. And then there's technology. Cryptocurrencies, blockchain systems, and central bank digital currencies are slowly offering alternatives to traditional fiat. The signs are subtle but undeniable. The world is quietly preparing for life beyond the dollar. When the dollar falls now, imagine a world where the dollar suddenly loses its value, where trust evaporates overnight. The first reaction would be panic. Central banks around the world holding trillions in dollar reserves would see their assets collapse in value. Financial institutions would face immediate liquidity crises. Oil, gas, and commodity markets would spiral out of control. Since global trade relies on stable pricing in dollars, the uncertainty would make contracts worthless and transactions chaotic. Trade would freeze, cargo ships would halt, factories would close. Even essential goods like food, medicine, and fuel would struggle to move across borders. Inside the US, the situation would turn dire. Imported products, electronics, cars, even food would become prohibitively expensive. Inflation would surge. Interest rates would explode. Stock markets would collapse, wiping out decades of accumulated wealth. Pension funds, savings, and investments would vanish in days. For nations already burdened by dollar-denominated debt, such as Argentina, Turkey, or many African economies, the pain would be unimaginable. Their currencies would crumble under the weight of their obligations. The fall of the dollar wouldn't just be a financial crisis, it would be a global reset, shaking every corner of civilization. Could the world survive without the dollar? So, could the world survive such a collapse? Yes, but not without years of chaos and reinvention. In the short term, global markets would plunge into uncertainty, but over time, new systems would rise to fill the vacuum. we might see a multipolar currency world where no single currency dominates. The euro, the Chinese yuan, or a digital global reserve could share the stage. China has long aimed to internationalize its yuan, but a lack of transparency and strict capital controls still limit global trust. The euro, while stable, lacks unified fiscal authority to replace the dollar's influence. Another candidate is the IMF's special drawing rights, SDRs, a basket of currencies that could serve as a neutral global standard. There's also the possibility of regional blocs forming their own currencies, such as a unified Asian or Middle Eastern digital reserve system. But make no mistake, without the dollar, global finance would become more fragmented, more volatile, and far less predictable. The fall of the dollar would mark the end of U.S. economic supremacy and the dawn of a new, uncertain world order. Winners, losers, and the new balance of power. In such a scenario, there are no true winners, only survivors. Countries already preparing for a post-dollar era, like China, Russia, and India, may endure the shock better. By building gold reserves, creating digital currencies, and trading in local money, they're diversifying their financial defenses. Commodity-rich nations, those sitting on oil, gas, or rare minerals, could temporarily gain leverage as resources become the new currency of power. But for developing economies tied deeply to the dollar, the Philippines, Egypt, Pakistan, and others, the consequences could be devastating. Their imports, debts, and reserves would collapse almost instantly. Even Europe, despite its economic strength, would face a deep recession. The global banking system, largely intertwined with the U.S., would face existential risk. The collapse of the dollar would not just reshape finance, it would reshape geopolitics. Power would shift eastward, alliances would fracture, and nations would compete to fill the void left by America's retreat. The truth, is the dollar really doomed? But here's the truth. The dollar isn't falling tomorrow. It remains the most trusted, liquid, and universally accepted currency on Earth. Even its biggest rivals rely on it. China still holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. The Eurozone banks operate through the dollar system. And in times of global crisis, from pandemics to wars, investors still run to the dollar, not away from it. Its dominance may eventually fade, yes, but gradually, not suddenly. The real future likely lies in de-dollarization, not destruction. A slow, steady decline as the world becomes more multipolar, more digital, and less dependent on any single nation. So rather than collapsing, the dollar might simply evolve, losing some of its global control, but keeping its credibility as the foundation of international trade. If the US dollar ever truly fell, the world wouldn't end, but it would be reborn. New systems would emerge, new powers would rise. Humanity would learn once again that every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually meets its turning point. Because history has always taught us this: gold loses shine, empires fade, but human ingenuity always rebuilds. So the real question isn't, can the world survive the fall of the dollar? It's, what kind of world will rise from its ashes?